medium to long term. Anything beyond a year. And that in the short term, if you have cash flow problems, it must be paid within the year and can only be a total of no more than 5% of the previous audited tax revenues. So if you have tax revenue of 2 trillion, that tells you what is 5%? Come on guys, you guys know numbers. You guys have numbers. When you're not doing numbers, nobody can shout at a number. What's 5% of 2 trillion? Come on. You guys are asleep over. What's 5% of 2 trillion? How much? Huh? How much? 10. You're very wrong, Bwana. Wait. What else? Who's got a number to volunteer? What's 5% of 2 trillion? 100 billion. So that is the maximum. And they even say that's an overdraft in CBK. So CBK literally prints that money. All right? The rest must go to development. So let's see how many numbers you guys can click. So we did what is called a primary balance. Primary balance is this. You look at the expenses of a country, right? And you remove one item called debt payments. So you say, what are our expenses? And then, what are our actual tax revenues? What are we paying in tax? So we did it from 2013 July to 2023 June last year. So, for example, development in those years was 6 trillion. So we put it there. What are the county expenses? We put it there. What are the salaries of the entire government? We put it there. What are pensions? We put it there. What are operational expenses? So the police have enough petrol to come and arrest you? Iko hapa. Na enough tear gas? Iko hapa. Haya. What is that number? 14.6 trillion. 10 years. Take note. And we said, okay. What did each and every one of us pay in terms of taxation? And you guys know you pay tax every day, so you buy goods and services. Yes. All of us pay tax. We are all shareholders to this enterprise called Kenya. And in 10 years, it is 13.3 trillion. So what is the deficit? You guys understand the deficit? Give that young man a clap. Good with numbers. So we say, okay, if that's the deficit, the law is very clear. That is all we needed to borrow. If you take 1.3 and you take the development of 6 trillion, what percentage is 1.3 trillion to 6 trillion? The development budget is 6 trillion over those years. 1.3 would be what percentage of that? Roughly what? 20? 21.6. Perfect. So you imagine we could have funded all our development and all we needed was 21%. 21.6%. Look at that. Give yourselves a clap. It tells you how powerful you are. You really are. Give yourselves a clap. We need nobody's money. We can do this. And if we say we don't want to borrow, we just remove that amount, 1.3 from 6, and what do you have? 4.7, is it? 4.7 trillion worth of development is a lot of development in 10 years. So we literally don't need to borrow. So what did the government of Uhuru do to us? They decided they are borrowing 7.7. And we needed 1.3. So they overborrowed by what kind of numbers? I want you to get used to these numbers, you know. 6.4 trillion above what we needed. Can you imagine that? That is nowhere in any budget. That exists nowhere in expenditure. It did not go, even though it would be illegal, to even paying one salary or giving the county. After all, they didn't need it, right? So 6.4 trillion, right? So he said, okay. Now I want you to understand your dilemma. So 6.4 trillion, 1.3 is 10 years. 6.4 trillion above is a deficit of how many years forward? 60. So you are enslaved to pay debt that has never come to your benefit, that went to other people. Other people. For the next 60 years. But the tragedy doesn't end there. He said, okay, how much did we pay in debt payments from our taxation? So up until 2022, it was 5.6. And then to 2023 June, 1.4. That is how much? 7 trillion. The taxes have paid 7 trillion. Remember, you only needed 1.3. Right? So I want you to help me with this. You only needed 1.3. People took 6.4 trillion of what you did not need. We did not need. And then we have paid 7 trillion on top of that. From each and every one of us. And what is the current outstanding of debt? Yes? 11 trillion. Give her a try. Okay, so you tell me how this makes sense. I want to throw it to you guys. We only needed 1.3. We overborrowed. Never came to us, 6.4. We have paid from our taxes 7 trillion, and we still owe 11 trillion, and it climbs every year. Uhuru's last borrowing in the year 2022 was 800 billion, both foreign and domestic. Ruto's borrowings last year was 1.4 trillion. And he proposes with his so-called supplementary budget this year to borrow another 1.6 this year, 1 trillion from domestic funds. So if you guys think you have a future, poleni sana. Poleni sana. So if you think there is anything larger than this, if you think Adani is larger than this, or you think what is larger than this, maybe you can tell me. All I can tell you is that you're doomed. You're doomed. Unless you cut off this snake. You cut off this snake. And you know, when you want to cut off a snake, what do you hit? The head. You literally have been made slaves. That is why your airports will go. Your ports will go. Your power will go. Your minerals will go. Your land will go. You are now going to be properly dominated. you think that's the life you want to live? It's up to you. We are bothering to try and educate you, to civically and peacefully try and tell you. But if you do not stand up now for your economic emancipation, you are doomed. You are doomed. I've been talking for 2 years. A lot of the media have asked Treasury officials to come and debate with me, and they will not face me. They've asked them to contradict my numbers, and they will not face me. They have never disputed what I'm saying. And I want you to understand that it was deliberate. So, who has a constitution next to me? Chapter 12 of our constitution is purely on our financial controls. So the constitution is the body of Kenya. Chapter 12, which activates the money, is like the heartbeat, so the blood can flow. So it is about our money. So you know what these guys did? They decided it doesn't work for them. I want you to understand criminals. So they said, for example, I think it's Article 206. What does Article 206 say? Is that on the consolidated fund? 206 or 204?
That there is only one account that the finances of a country can go to, whether it's foreign or domestic debt or taxes.
Correct. And it gives an exception. A and B.
Except for when there's a government fund, like an account for a specific project.
Correct, like the Petroleum Development Fund. Mm-hmm. And B, appropriations in aid. It's like profit from a ministry. All right? So that part of the Constitution, let's repeat. Naona watu hii mnasoma vizuri.
I wish to excuse myself first of all by saying I'm a literature student, not a law student, but I know my way around the Constitution as well. So, according to the law Jimmie was referring to, the funds of a country, all the funds of Kenya, for example, our country, since it's our constitution, can only go to one account. And it's even given a number of what that account is to be called. I've just forgotten it.
Yes. And
it gives two exceptions: charity and a specific fund that the government has created to fund a project.
Very well. Give him a clap. So that 206 in the Constitution was copy-pasted in the Public Finance Management Act. So exception A and B as per the Constitution. A fund created by Parliament, and B, if there is extra money, A and A. So in March 2013, the leader of majority takes an amendment to Parliament. This is now Duale at the time. People were all very young. So Duale takes an amendment to Parliament, amending that section in the Public Finance Management Act, adding C and D. And C and D, if you read it, has got to do with loans. That loans and their expenses do not need to come to Kenya. They do not need to enter the consolidated fund. So they illegally amend the constitution with statute law below the constitution. It is illegal. And the Attorney General at the time gives, and I hope one of these days you have him up here so you can question him, gives a legal opinion about how that is very lawful. The seconder of that motion in March 2014 was a minority leader called John Wanjigi. So they decided that money does not need to come to that account. When it doesn't come to that account, the controller of budget has no control over its expenditure. The Auditor General does not audit. So the Constitution was illegally amended. That was number one. Criminal act. Intentional act. Intention to defraud the people of Kenya. Number two, they decided there is an article 220. What does 220 say? Who has the constitution before them? 220 is a definition of the budget. Do you have it? Who has the constitution? Come on, guys. You don't have these things on your phone. You cannot learn economics and public finance management if you do not know the law. Yes. Microphone, pardon. Yeah, man, that's correct.
It states that budgets of the national county governments shall contain
slowly. Shall contain
estimates of revenue and expenditure, differentiating between recurrent and development expenditure.
Stop there. So shall contain estimates of revenue and estimates of expenditure. The revenue is all the revenue that will be collected, envisaged to be collected by tax. And all the revenue, including deficit, that the government intends to borrow, so that it is a revenue estimate that balances with the expenditure. They decided from 2014 they shall not include in the budget, which becomes the appropriation bill, estimates of revenue. And that, for your information, is now a case before SCOC. Supreme Court is to rule on a ruling made by the Court of Appeal that you cannot anchor the finance bill without the revenue estimates. So it nullified Finance Bill 2023. So they were excluding it intentionally because it does not correspond to the expenditure side. If you put the debt there, it can't show in development expenditure where that money is going. Act number 2. Act number 3. Article 223 of the Constitution talks about a supplementary budget. Young man, why don't you read it?
It says, supplementary appropriation. Subject to clauses 2 to 4, the national government may spend money that has not been appropriated if A, the amount appropriated for any purpose under the Appropriation Act is insufficient or a need has arisen
for expenditure for a purpose for which no amount has been appropriated by that act, or B, money has been withdrawn from the contingencies fund.
And does it give a percentage?
No.
It doesn't. Insufficient funds. Right. In PFM, they're going to add the insufficient funds as no more than 10% of the value of a project. So it has already been budgeted. If you have a road of 100 million, you can look for 10 million to add if there were unforeseen circumstances. These guys introduced fraud number 3, something called supplementary 2, which became projects from 0 to 100. Nothing about insufficient funds. New projects. And I've seen a young man going around the country saying, this one was launched in this year. This one was launched in this year. These are the ones that are in those supplementaries. They became book items to extract money. So a fraud was begun in 2014. You've been living it for the last 10 years. The last 10 years, it was intentional. You shall never be free until you rid yourself of this fraud. And I want to tell you the bright side. This year, there's arguments about how much debt payments are. And they range between 1.8 trillion to 2.1 trillion. Debt today is operating between 65 to 78% of our tax revenue. So for every 100 shillings, about 80 shillings, 78 shillings is going to debt, depending on the month. Now, you imagine if that money was not going out to this illegal debt. Of that debt of 11 trillion, 5.4 trillion is money that is our savings from our banks, that you cannot put towards even one project. 5.4 trillion. That you cannot put towards even one salary. What we see are bankers here earning huge bonuses and huge salaries and huge dividends as banks. That 5.4 in 10 years, the interest payments on domestic debt has totaled 2.8 trillion shillings.